Fred Hoyle was the man who named the Big Bang and spent the rest of his life trying to prove it never happened. That paradox, almost poetic in its irony, has haunted the legacy of Fred Hoyle. It tells us everything about his character, a man who could frame the vocabulary of modern cosmology while fiercely rejecting the very idea that the phrase came to represent. He was a rebel, a contrarian, a thinker who refused to bow to consensus even when the tide of evidence rose against him. To understand Hoyle, we must first return to the quiet hills of Yorkshire, where a stubborn boy was born who would one day challenge the universe itself. Fred Hoyle was born on the 24th of June, 1915, in the small market town of Bingley, West Yorkshire. Yorkshire was not Cambridge or London. It was not the hub of academic prestige or the marble corridors of aristocracy. It was working-class England, mills, coal smoke, narrow streets, the chatter of ordinary people whose lives revolved around work and survival. Growing up in that environment gave Hoyle something most Cambridge dons lacked: toughness, resilience, and a distaste for pretension. Later in life, when confronted with the arrogance of academia, he often sneered that scientists from elite backgrounds lived in ivory towers. He, by contrast, had come from grit and stone, from the stubborn hills of the north. It was here, among the rolling fields and industrial landscapes, that Hoyle's contrarian streak began to form. Yorkshiremen, it was said, were famously blunt. They called things as they saw them, with little patience for flattery or diplomacy. Fred embodied this cultural inheritance from an early age. Family stories recall that Fred was not an easy child to manage. He questioned rules, resisted instructions, and had an instinctive distrust of authority. Teachers quickly learned that this boy did not simply absorb information. He argued, debated, and sometimes outright mocked the way lessons were taught. Mathematics fascinated him. Numbers, unlike people, could not be bent by authority or power. They obeyed laws of logic, not the whims of politicians or priests. Fred devoured mathematical puzzles and celestial stories, sneaking into libraries where dusty astronomy books sparked his imagination. But there was also a streak of defiance. When told that the universe was created at a single moment in time, as many religious texts claimed, Fred scoffed. "Why should there be a beginning?" he once asked, decades before formulating his steady-state theory. Even as a child, he wanted the freedom to think differently. Hoyle's school years were marked by conflict between his brilliance and his attitude. He was undoubtedly gifted, yet he often frustrated his teachers with insolence. He would not simply memorize, he demanded explanations. Once, when a teacher insisted that an answer in mathematics should be written a particular way, Fred retorted, "If the result is the same, what does it matter?" That defiance of authority, challenging the method rather than the result, would become the hallmark of his career. Despite his clashes, Hoyle excelled academically. He won a scholarship to Emmanuel College, Cambridge, to study mathematics. For a boy from Bingley, this was an extraordinary leap. But Fred carried with him the spirit of Yorkshire into the heart of Britain's intellectual elite. Arriving in Cambridge in the 1932nd, Hoyle encountered a world utterly alien to his upbringing. The college quads were filled with sons of aristocrats, polished accents, and traditions steeped in centuries of privilege. Fred, with his blunt Yorkshire speech, was an outsider. He made little effort to hide his disdain for the snobbery around him. While many students embraced the rituals of Cambridge formal dinners, elaborate gowns, Fred dismissed them as nonsense. He was there for ideas, not ceremonies. Mathematics came naturally to him, but it was astrophysics that captured his passion. He began attending lectures on the nature of stars, galaxies, and the vast cosmos beyond Earth. Unlike many of his peers, who were content to follow established theories, Fred constantly asked, "But what if they're wrong?" It was at Cambridge that the pattern of his life began. Brilliance combined with provocation, respect for ideas but not for authority. He was recognized as a rising talent, yet professors whispered about his attitude. He had the ability to be great if only he could learn to play along. But Fred Hoyle was not built to play along. The outbreak of World War II interrupted his academic path. Hoyle joined the war effort, working at the Admiralty on the development of radar. This was not glamorous stargazing. It was applied physics with life and death consequences. German bombers threatened Britain, and radar was one of the nation's few defenses. Here, Hoyle's practical genius shone. He was not only a theorist but also a problem solver. He devised methods for improving radar detection, sharpening Britain's defensive edge. Colleagues respected his intellect, but they also noted his bluntness. He had no patience for bureaucracy or rigid hierarchies, even in wartime. These years hardened his contrarian streak. War taught him that survival depended on questioning assumptions and improvising. After the war, when he returned to Cambridge, he carried that mentality with him into the realm of cosmology. By the mid-1942, Fred Hoyle was no longer the boy from Bingley, but a rising Cambridge scientist. Yet his personality remained rooted in Yorkshire soil, tough, blunt, rebellious. He refused to be overawed by titles or reputations. He distrusted consensus, often arguing that when everyone agrees, it usually means no one is thinking. Friends admired his wit. Enemies complained of his arrogance. Students found him captivating, his lectures filled with daring ideas and sharp humor. He spoke not as a distant don, but as a provocateur, daring them to challenge him. What truly set Hoyle apart, however, was his refusal to treat science as sacred dogma. To him, science was not a cathedral of truths, but a battlefield of ideas. And he intended to fight with every weapon of logic and imagination he possessed. Even before his most famous battles, Hoyle had already established himself as a man who would not follow the crowd. His early research in astrophysics hinted at boldness. He explored how stars generated energy, how elements were formed, and how the universe might operate on the grandest scales. But what colleagues found most striking was not his equations, but his attitude. He was fearless in pointing out flaws in others' work, sometimes brutally so. He dismissed popular theories as nonsense if they didn't satisfy his logic. This earned him both admiration and resentment. To some, Hoyle was a breath of fresh air, a scientist unafraid to question dogma. To others, he was a troublemaker, disrespectful of the giants on whose shoulders he stood. Both views were correct, for Fred Hoyle was both a pioneer and a provocateur. By the late 1942, Fred Hoyle stood at the threshold of greatness. He had survived the war, sharpened his intellect, and embraced a contrarian philosophy that would define his career. The world of cosmology was shifting. Competing theories of the universe's origin, Big Bang versus steady state, were about to clash. Hoyle was ready. Armed with his Yorkshire bluntness, his Cambridge training, and his rebellious spirit, he would soon launch himself into one of the greatest scientific battles of the 20th century. He was not destined to be merely another professor at Cambridge. He was destined to be the man who named the Big Bang, even as he spent his life rejecting it. And so begins the story of Fred Hoyle, the boy from Yorkshire who refused to bow, the scientist who challenged the universe itself, the contrarian whose legacy still unsettles the history of cosmology. Fred Hoyle arrived at Cambridge in the 1932nd, carrying little more than his Yorkshire stubbornness and his sharp mathematical mind. For him, the journey from the smoky streets of Bingley to the ancient quads of Emmanuel College was nothing short of entering a different world. Cambridge was a fortress of privilege. Sons of aristocrats and wealthy industrialists filled the lecture halls. The dining halls echoed with clipped accents, Latin mottos, and rituals passed down for centuries. Yet among them strode a young man with a flat Yorkshire accent, unimpressed by tradition and utterly unwilling to disguise where he came from. While many students bent themselves into the Cambridge mold, Fred resisted. He wore his working-class origins like a badge. His mannerisms were blunt, his speech sharp. Professors and peers alike noticed that this was not a man easily tamed by convention. To Hoyle, what mattered was not who your father was or what title you carried. What mattered was the clarity of your ideas. Initially, Hoyle devoted himself to pure mathematics. He was drawn to the precision, the elegance of equations that yielded exact answers. Yet even in those early years, he was restless. Numbers alone were not enough. He wanted to understand the physical world they described. It was in astrophysics that he found his true calling. Attending lectures by Arthur Eddington and other Cambridge luminaries, Hoyle became captivated by the grand questions of the universe. How did stars shine? What powered their immense energy? Could mathematics explain the very birth and fate of the cosmos? Here his personality showed again. He was not content merely to absorb what was taught. He challenged lecturers, pointed out contradictions, and frequently continued debates long after class. Some professors admired his boldness. Others dismissed him as arrogant. Either way, Fred had announced himself as someone who would never accept authority without interrogation. Cambridge shaped Hoyle, but it did not tame him. He developed habits that marked him for life. He worked at odd hours, preferring solitary thinking to collaborative compromise. He scoffed at academic politics, avoiding committees and ceremonies whenever possible. He preferred to be alone with his equations, his chalk, and his rebellious imagination. Among his peers, Fred earned a reputation for brilliance wrapped in bluntness. He was witty, but cutting, capable of skewering an argument with a single sarcastic remark. To those who valued tradition, he was abrasive. To those who valued originality, he was exhilarating. The calm of academic life did not last. In 1939, the world was thrust into war. Cambridge was transformed. Young men volunteered or were conscripted, research labs were repurposed, and the focus of science shifted from the stars to survival. Fred Hoyle joined the war effort at the Admiralty, where he worked on radar. This technology, still in its relative infancy, would prove decisive in Britain's defense against German bombers. Hoyle's job was not glamorous theory, but practical physics, improving detection, refining calculations, and ensuring Britain's radar systems could see what the eye could not. It was here that Hoyle's contrarian brilliance shone. He had little patience for military bureaucracy, which he considered slow and inefficient. When told to follow rigid procedures, he often ignored them if he thought he could devise a better solution. Superiors alternately praised and cursed him. He produced results, but he refused to play the obedient officer. The war left a deep impression on Hoyle. It taught him that science was not just an ivory tower pursuit. It could determine the fate of nations, but it also reinforced his disdain for authority. Again and again, he saw bureaucrats cling to bad ideas simply because they were official policy. For Fred, the war confirmed that true progress came not from obeying rules, but from questioning them. This experience hardened his personality. He returned from the war more convinced than ever that independent thought mattered more than conformity. He had seen too much waste, too many errors committed by those who valued hierarchy over logic. He vowed that in his scientific career he would bow to no authority, be it academic, political, or religious. Colleagues from this period described Hoyle as brilliant but exasperating. He was quick with solutions, but also quick with scorn for those who disagreed. He could inspire with his insights, yet alienate with his sarcasm. In many ways, the war distilled his essence, pragmatic genius combined with irrepressible contrarianism. He often joked that radar work was his apprenticeship in applied rebellion. When the war ended, he carried that apprenticeship back into the halls of Cambridge. The universe awaited, and Fred Hoyle was ready to confront it with the same defiance he had shown to military bureaucracy. By 1945, Fred Hoyle was no longer just a mathematician from Cambridge. He was a physicist, forged in the crucible of global conflict, a man who had applied his intellect to national survival. Yet beneath the surface, he remained what he had always been, the Yorkshire boy who resisted authority, who trusted his own mind above all others. As peace returned, Hoyle returned to his true passion, the stars. But he did not return quietly. The war had amplified his conviction that progress depended on defiance. And in the years to come, that defiance would explode onto the stage of cosmology. Hoyle was ready to challenge not just his colleagues, but the very origins of the universe itself. When the war ended in 1945, Fred Hoyle returned to Cambridge a changed man. He was no longer simply the sharp Yorkshire lad studying mathematics. He was a physicist who had worked at the front line of Britain's survival. He carried with him lessons of pragmatism, impatience with bureaucracy, and above all, the conviction that independent thought was the only true defense against error. Cambridge welcomed back many young scientists, some shaken by the war, others energized. Hoyle fell into the second category. The wartime years had shown him that science was not a museum of knowledge, but a living, urgent enterprise. Ideas mattered. Wrong ideas could cost lives. And so, as he looked up once again to the stars, he was determined to think differently about the cosmos. Post-war Cambridge was alive with cosmological debates. Questions about the universe's origin had never been more pressing. Einstein's general relativity had reshaped the framework of cosmology. New telescopes were delivering data that challenged long-held assumptions. For many, the natural conclusion was that the universe had expanded from a single beginning, a moment of creation, finite and unique. Yet Hoyle bristled at the very thought. To him, the idea of a universe with a beginning smacked of theology. It echoed too closely the book of Genesis with its divine act of creation. Science, Hoyle believed, must stand apart from myth, and so restlessness grew inside him. He could not accept a cosmos born from nothing, a single explosion out of the void. His contrarian instinct demanded an alternative. Together with two like-minded colleagues, Herman Bondi and Thomas Gold, Hoyle began to shape a radical alternative. The trio often met at Cambridge pubs, their conversations a mixture of mathematics, physics, and sheer audacity. They asked, what if the universe had no beginning? What if it had always existed, eternal and unchanging in its overall appearance, even as it expanded? It was an outrageous thought, flying in the face of both data and prevailing interpretation. Yet Hoyle felt liberated by it. He argued that the elegance of physics demanded continuity, not a sudden, inexplicable birth. An eternal universe was, in his mind, far more logical than a cosmic firework. From these discussions emerged what became known as the steady-state theory. Its premise was simple yet radical. The universe was expanding, yes, but new matter was continuously created to maintain a constant density. Thus, while galaxies moved apart, the universe on the largest scales looked the same at all times, hence a steady state. For Hoyle, this theory was more than mathematics. It was philosophy. It freed cosmology from the shadow of religious creation myths. It affirmed an eternal universe, without beginning or end, governed solely by natural laws. Critics immediately scoffed. How could matter simply appear from nothing? Was this not more magical than the Big Bang itself? But Hoyle was undeterred. He insisted that science should not shy away from bold hypotheses. The role of theory was to propose possibilities, to expand the imagination, to resist premature closure. The development of the steady-state theory revealed much about Hoyle's character. He was not afraid of ridicule. He thrived on intellectual combat. Where others might retreat in the face of skepticism, Hoyle sharpened his arguments and attacked his critics with biting wit. At conferences, he presented the steady-state model with the confidence of a man who believed not only in his equations, but in the value of defiance itself. He once quipped that scientists who embraced a cosmic beginning were letting theology back into the back door of physics. Such remarks, half joke, half accusation, earned him both admirers and enemies. His Yorkshire bluntness made him a natural rebel. He did not couch his ideas in cautious language. He declared them boldly, as though daring the universe itself to disagree. To understand Hoyle's rebellion, one must recall the intellectual climate of the late 1942. The so-called Big Bang model, though not yet universally accepted, was gaining traction. Observations of galactic redshifts by Edwin Hubble suggested expansion. The mathematics of general relativity pointed to a universe with a finite age. For many, the evidence was converging, but Hoyle resisted consensus. He saw the rush toward a cosmic beginning as premature as an abandonment of skepticism. He believed science must keep multiple possibilities alive until overwhelming evidence forced a decision. To him, the Big Bang was not overwhelming, it was ideological. The partnership with Bondi and Gould was crucial. All three men shared a taste for bold speculation. Gould, in particular, was as much philosopher as scientist, unafraid of radical leaps. Bondi contributed rigorous mathematics. Together they crafted arguments that transformed their barroom musings into published theory. In 1948, they unveiled the steady-state theory in a series of papers. The reaction was electric. Some hailed the idea as daring and elegant. Others dismissed it as fanciful, but no one ignored it. Fred Hoyle had declared himself on the world stage as a cosmologist of audacity and defiance. Why did Hoyle embrace the steady state so fiercely? It was not simply scientific preference, it was personal. He despised conformity. He distrusted ideas that smacked of authority, whether religious or academic. To him, the Big Bang reeked of Genesis, of divine creation, cloaked in scientific language. He could not abide that. More than that, the steady-state theory reflected his lifelong pattern. When told the universe must have a beginning, he instinctively said, "Why?" When told matter could not be created, he replied, "Who says?" His rebellious temperament shaped his science. He did not simply think differently, he needed to think differently. By the end of the 1942nd, Fred Hoyle had become a central figure in cosmology. He was no longer merely a promising Cambridge scientist. He was a rebel with a theory, a man unafraid to stand against the rising tide of the Big Bang. The seeds of rebellion had been sown. Soon, they would blossom into one of the most dramatic intellectual battles of the 20th century, a battle that would define Hoyle's career, his reputation, and his place in history. And at the heart of it all was not just mathematics, but personality. Fred Hoyle's refusal to bow, his insistence on questioning, his love of controversy. He was not simply doing science, he was living out the contrarian spirit that had defined him since childhood. It was 1949, and radio was still the most powerful medium of communication in Britain. Families gathered around their sets as if around a hearth. The BBC carried not only news and music, but also the voices of scientists who explained the mysteries of the world to the public. On one such night, a Yorkshire accented voice came across the airwaves, sharp, confident, and unafraid of controversy. It was Fred Hoyle, invited to speak about cosmology. The world expected sober explanation. What it received was a phrase that would change the language of science forever. Hoyle, defending the steady-state theory, was contrasting his model with the rival idea of a universe born in a singular moment. With disdain, he described it as a kind of grand cosmic explosion. Then, almost casually, he added, These theories were based on the hypothesis that all matter in the universe was created in one Big Bang at a particular time in the remote past. The words were thrown out as mockery. Big Bang was not intended as a serious scientific term. It was sarcasm, Hoyle's way of lampooning an idea he thought primitive and unscientific. Yet the phrase stuck. Newspapers repeated it. Journalists loved it. Even rival scientists began to use it first with irony, then with acceptance. Within a few years, Big Bang became the universal shorthand for the very theory Hoyle despised. This was the ultimate irony of Fred Hoyle's life. The man who named the Big Bang spent the rest of his career trying to demolish it. He gave his enemy its banner, its slogan, its identity. Without Hoyle, the theory might have remained buried in jargon like cosmic singularity or primeval atom. Instead, thanks to Hoyle's wit, it had a brand. When asked later about coining the term, Hoyle maintained he had not meant it seriously. It was just a phrase that slipped out, he said, but by then it was too late. The name had traveled too far, sunk too deeply into public consciousness. The story of the Big Bang phrase reveals as much about Hoyle's character as it does about cosmology. He was witty, quick with a barb, and deeply aware of the power of words. Unlike many scientists who spoke in cautious equations, Hoyle relished dramatic expression. He enjoyed turning science into theater. But there was also arrogance. He underestimated how language shapes thought. He believed the mockery would undermine the theory. Instead, it popularized it. His sarcasm became his rival's greatest weapon. This paradox captures Hoyle's essence: brilliant but self-defeating, bold yet blind to consequence. He wanted to dominate the conversation, and he did, but in doing so, he immortalized the very idea he hated. The 1,949 broadcasts also marked Hoyle's rise as a public intellectual. Unlike many of his peers who avoided mass media, Hoyle embraced it. He believed science should be communicated directly, without pomp or condescension. His Yorkshire accent, rare on the BBC, made him stand out. It gave him authenticity, a voice of the people rather than the elite. Listeners found him engaging, even if they did not always agree. He explained galaxies and stars in language ordinary people could grasp. He sprinkled his talks with humor, sometimes biting, sometimes playful. He turned the abstract into the vivid. This skill would later serve him well as a science fiction writer and popularizer. But in 1949, it was still novel. A Cambridge professor who spoke like a rebel, unafraid of controversy, unconcerned with reputation. Among scientists, reactions were mixed. Supporters of the Big Bang bristled at Hoyle's mockery. Some saw it as disrespectful, others as clever wordplay. Younger astronomers chuckled at the phrase, repeating it in private. Older professors shook their heads. Yet even his critics admitted, Hoyle had a gift. He could make cosmology sound alive. His words reached beyond journals and conferences into the living rooms of Britain. For a field often accused of remoteness, this was a shock. At Cambridge, colleagues muttered about his growing celebrity. Some resented his popularity, arguing that serious science should not be packaged for the masses. Hoyle ignored them. He relished the stage, the microphone, the chance to provoke. The coining of Big Bang deepened the divide between Hoyle and those who supported a finite age universe. Figures like Georges Lemaitre, who had proposed the primeval atom, and George Gamow, who advanced hot universe models, now found themselves under a banner they had not chosen but could not refuse. Gamow, with his own taste for humor, adopted the term readily. He used it in lectures, books, and jokes. The irony delighted him. Hoyle's insult had become his flag. Hoyle, meanwhile, seethed as he realized the phrase had escaped his control. This rivalry was not merely scientific, it was personal. Hoyle felt surrounded by consensus, ganged up on by what he called orthodox cosmologists. They, in turn, saw him as stubborn, unwilling to admit defeat even when evidence mounted. By the early 1952, the lines were drawn. On one side stood the Big Bang model, gaining traction as more data arrived. On the other stood Hoyle's steady-state theory, elegant, eternal, defiant, and looming over both was the phrase Big Bang, a linguistic grenade thrown by Hoyle himself. The world of cosmology was heading for its greatest showdown, and Fred Hoyle, never one to back away from a fight, was ready. In the mid-20th century, one of the deepest mysteries in science was simple to ask, yet complex to answer. Where do the elements come from? Hydrogen and helium, the simplest atoms, seemed easy enough to explain. But what about carbon, oxygen, iron atoms that made up the earth, life, and everything familiar to human beings? The periodic table was well known, yet its cosmic origin was not. Some scientists believed heavy elements had been present since the birth of the universe. Others speculated they were born in violent cosmic events. The question remained unresolved. For Hoyle, this was not just a puzzle, it was an opportunity. It appealed to both his mathematical rigor and his imaginative daring. He sensed that the stars themselves might hold the answer. Fred Hoyle approached the problem with his usual contrarian flair. Where others saw barriers, he saw possibilities. Where others trusted convention, he distrusted it. He was willing to consider what many dismissed as impossible. His key insight was that stars, far from being static or eternal lights in the sky, were nuclear furnaces. They were engines where particles collided, fused, and transformed. If hydrogen could fuse into helium, perhaps helium could fuse further into heavier elements. This idea was not entirely new, but Hoyle developed it with unmatched depth and rigor. He worked through the mathematics, tracing possible chains of nuclear reactions, calculating how temperatures and pressures in stellar cores might give rise to the building blocks of life. One of Hoyle's most famous predictions emerged here, the triple alpha process. The puzzle was carbon. It is essential to life, yet difficult to produce in stars. Two helium nuclei, alpha particles, could combine to form beryllium-8, but this isotope was unstable, decaying almost instantly. How then could carbon form? Hoyle proposed a daring solution. Perhaps there was a special energy level, a resonance in carbon-12, that allowed three alpha particles to fuse together long enough to create stable carbon. This was an outrageous prediction. No one had ever observed such a resonance. But Hoyle insisted it must exist, because without it, life itself could not exist. In one of the most remarkable episodes in theoretical astrophysics, experimental physicists later confirmed Hoyle's prediction. The resonance was real. Carbon existed thanks to the very process Hoyle had deduced. Hoyle did not work alone. Alongside Margaret Burbidge, Geoffrey Burbidge, and William Fowler, he co-authored what became one of the most influential papers in astrophysics, the 1957 B² FH paper, named for the initials of its four authors. This monumental work laid out a comprehensive theory of stellar nucleosynthesis, the idea that all the elements heavier than helium were forged in the hearts of stars through successive nuclear reactions. From carbon to iron, from oxygen to silicon, the building blocks of planets and people were the products of cosmic furnaces. The B² FH paper changed astrophysics forever. It transformed the understanding of the universe from static matter to dynamic creation. Stars were no longer just ornaments in the sky. They were factories, alchemists, creators of the very atoms that made human beings possible. Even in this triumph, Hoyle's personality shone through. He argued fiercely with his collaborators, sometimes dismissing their doubts with characteristic bluntness. Yet he also inspired them with his vision. Margaret Burbidge later recalled his relentless confidence, his ability to see beyond what data alone could suggest. Hoyle's conviction that carbon must exist because life exists was a profound example of his contrarian thinking. Most scientists avoided such anthropic arguments, considering them unscientific. Hoyle embraced it, insisting that logic demanded it. His willingness to take intellectual risks distinguished him from more cautious colleagues. The discovery of nucleosynthesis should have been Hoyle's crowning glory. Yet recognition came unevenly. In 1983, William Fowler received the Nobel Prize in Physics for his contributions to nuclear astrophysics. Hoyle was conspicuously excluded. The omission outraged many in the scientific community. Hoyle's role had been central, his prediction of the carbon resonance legendary. Yet his abrasive personality and controversial stances, particularly his rejection of the Big Bang, may have cost him the ultimate honor. Hoyle himself, true to character, expressed contempt for the Nobel Committee. He dismissed the prize as a political tool, awarded not purely for science, but for conformity. Once again, he stood as the rebel, admired for his work, yet punished for his defiance. Hoyle had set out to challenge the Big Bang, yet his greatest scientific contribution, stellar nucleosynthesis, fits seamlessly into the Big Bang framework. Ironically, the theory he opposed so fiercely was strengthened by the very discoveries he had made. This irony did not escape his critics. They pointed out that Hoyle had, in effect, armed his opponents, yet Hoyle himself never saw it that way. For him, science was about the pursuit of truth, not about reinforcing ideologies. If his discoveries supported the Big Bang in the eyes of others, so be it. He remained unconvinced. Every breath a human takes, every carbon atom in every cell, carries the legacy of Fred Hoyle's insight. Without his work on nucleosynthesis, the story of the universe would be incomplete. Hoyle often said, "We are made of stardust." Though others have repeated the phrase, it was his intellectual labor that made it more than poetry. It was fact. Humanity, in the deepest sense, is the child of stars. Hoyle was not simply a scientist of equations. He was a man whose rebellious personality shaped his discoveries. He refused to accept the impossible. He demanded that the universe make sense, even if it meant proposing what others thought absurd. In doing so, he revealed the alchemy of the stars. By the early 1952, Fred Hoyle should have been a celebrated figure at Cambridge. He had helped reshape astrophysics with stellar nucleosynthesis. He was a gifted communicator, popular with the public. He had coined a phrase that had entered the global vocabulary. Yet instead of rising smoothly into the pantheon of Cambridge respectability, Hoyle became more and more of an outsider. The very traits that gave him brilliance, his bluntness, his defiance of convention, his refusal to flatter, made him a thorn in the side of the academic establishment. He was not the kind of professor who bowed politely to senior dons, who smiled through committee meetings, or who treated tradition with reverence. He was, unapologetically, Fred Hoyle of Yorkshire. Cambridge, for all its intellectual glory, was also a place of politics. Appointments, honors, fellowships, and committees. Advancement often depended not only on talent, but also on diplomacy. Hoyle had little of the latter. In meetings, he was notorious for his sharp tongue. If he thought an idea was foolish, he said so, without hesitation or euphemism. If he considered a proposal a waste of time, he dismissed it. His colleagues found him abrasive, sometimes humiliating. This behavior won him enemies. Academic life, though outwardly genteel, was a web of egos and alliances. Hoyle, who cared little for such games, often blundered into conflict. His Yorkshire directness was refreshing to some but offensive to others. As a lecturer, however, Hoyle was magnetic. Students adored him. He spoke not like a cautious don, but like a daring storyteller. His lectures on cosmology and astrophysics were lively, peppered with jokes, jabs at rival theories, and a sense of intellectual adventure. Unlike many professors who read monotonously from notes, Hoyle spoke freely, pacing the room, scribbling on the board with energy. He challenged his students to think, not memorize. "Don't accept what I say," he often told them. "Test it, argue with it." This rebellious style won him a devoted following among young minds, but it also widened the gap between Hoyle and the Cambridge hierarchy. He inspired students, but he unsettled colleagues. In academic culture, networking mattered. Honors were often shared, collaborations carefully managed. Hoyle refused to participate in this dance. He saw it as hypocrisy, a betrayal of intellectual honesty. When invited to soften his criticisms of rival theories, he refused. When urged to publish cautiously, he resisted. When offered chances to curry favor with influential figures, he dismissed them. For Hoyle, integrity meant saying what he believed, regardless of the cost. This refusal to compromise won him respect outside Cambridge, especially among those who admired independent thinkers, but it limited his rise within the university itself. He became a paradox, celebrated internationally, marginalized locally. The growing battle between the steady-state theory and the Big Bang model only sharpened Hoyle's outsider status. Within Cambridge, many younger cosmologists were increasingly persuaded by observational evidence supporting a finite-age universe. Hoyle fought back fiercely. In seminars, he demolished arguments with biting wit. He mocked the idea of a universe created in a single moment as an echo of Genesis. To religiously inclined colleagues, this was offensive. To cautious academics, it was reckless. His opponents whispered that Hoyle was brilliant but blinded by his own stubbornness. He, in turn, accused them of intellectual cowardice. The atmosphere became charged, personal, and bitter. Ironically, while Hoyle's standing within Cambridge was strained, his reputation outside the ivory tower flourished. His BBC broadcasts, popular science writings, and bold statements made him a household name. The public admired him as a scientist who spoke plainly, who dared to challenge orthodoxy. Cambridge, however, was less forgiving. Some colleagues resented his celebrity, seeing it as vulgar showmanship. They believed serious scientists should stay in the journals, not the newspapers. Hoyle's ability to captivate the masses only deepened his outsider status among the elite. In 1972, Fred Hoyle was knighted for his services to astronomy. It was a recognition of his stature, his contributions to science, and his role as a communicator. Yet within Cambridge, honors remained elusive. He was passed over for posts he might have expected, denied positions of authority, others with less achievement obtained. The greatest insult came in 1973 when he was denied the Plumian Professorship of Astronomy, one of Cambridge's most prestigious chairs. Hoyle, already world famous, had every qualification. Yet the appointment went to someone else. For Hoyle, this was not just professional disappointment. It was proof that Cambridge would never fully accept him. Rather than soften him, these experiences hardened Hoyle's contrarian identity. He began to wear his outsider status like armor. He joked about being the black sheep of Cambridge, the rebel in a sea of conformists. He cultivated the image of the maverick, unafraid of rejection. Yet privately, the slight stung. He knew his work deserved recognition. He felt betrayed by an institution he had served for decades. The irony was painful. Hoyle, who distrusted authority, still longed for acknowledgment from it. By the 1962nd and 1972nd, Fred Hoyle had become a legend at Cambridge, but not a comfortable one. He was admired, feared, and sometimes avoided. He was the man who had predicted the resonance that gave birth to carbon, who had helped rewrite the story of the stars, who had popularized cosmology for the public. And yet, he remained an outsider inside Cambridge. Brilliant but controversial, respected but marginalized, loved by students but distrusted by peers. It was a role he both despised and embraced. It fueled his contrarian energy, his willingness to fight battles few others dared. And it set the stage for his next great controversies, ideas about life, evolution, and the cosmos that would push him even further from the scientific mainstream. Fred Hoyle's work on nucleosynthesis had shown how the stars forged the elements of life. But for Hoyle, that was not enough. The question pressed further. If the atoms of life came from stars, what about life itself? To most scientists, the answer lay on Earth. Life, they believed, had emerged here through chemical evolution from the so-called primordial soup. Darwin's theory of natural selection explained how it diversified, and modern biology was filling in the chemical details. Hoyle, true to form, was unconvinced. He looked at the complexity of DNA, the structure of proteins, and the improbability of random assembly. To him, the numbers did not add up. The chance of life arising spontaneously on Earth, he argued, was effectively zero. There had to be another explanation. Hoyle never denied that evolution by natural selection occurred. He accepted that species changed and adapted, but he rejected the idea that chance and earthbound chemistry alone could explain the origin of life. In interviews, he used characteristically blunt analogies. One of his most famous was the tornado in a junkyard. The probability of life arising by chance on Earth, he said, was as absurd as a tornado sweeping through a junkyard and assembling a fully functioning Boeing 747. The phrase spread widely, provoking both outrage and fascination. Biologists accused Hoyle of misunderstanding evolution, of attacking a straw man. Hoyle fired back that they were the ones ignoring the mathematics of improbability. For him, the Darwinian orthodoxy had become dogma, and he, once again, was the rebel daring to challenge it. Hoyle found a kindred spirit in the Sri Lankan astrophysicist Chandra Wickramasinghe, who joined him at Cambridge. Together they developed and defended a radical alternative, panspermia, the idea that life did not originate on Earth at all but was seeded from space. They argued that comets and interstellar dust carried organic molecules, perhaps even microbes, across the cosmos. Earth, in this view, was not the cradle but the receiver. Life was a cosmic phenomenon, not a terrestrial accident. Hoyle and Wickramasinghe produced papers, books, and lectures advancing this vision. They suggested that the galaxy was teeming with biological material, constantly raining down on planets. In their model, life on Earth was part of a vast cosmic continuum. In the 1972nd and 1982nd, Hoyle and Wickramasinghe went further. They claimed that viruses and diseases might even come from space. Outbreaks of influenza, they suggested, could be linked to cosmic dust entering Earth's atmosphere. Such claims outraged the medical community. To most scientists, viruses were well understood as terrestrial phenomena evolving within ecosystems. But Hoyle insisted the evidence for spontaneous terrestrial origin was weak. He preferred the grander cosmic explanation. Critics dismissed the idea as pseudoscience. Journals were reluctant to publish. Yet Hoyle thrived on the controversy. His defiance of orthodoxy, his willingness to provoke, were once again on full display. The public, as always, was intrigued. Newspapers ran headlines about space germs and life from the stars. Some dismissed Hoyle as eccentric. Others admired his audacity. Science fiction fans, in particular, found inspiration in his vision of a universe alive with biology. Hoyle's reputation as a contrarian deepened. He was no longer just the man who opposed the Big Bang. He was the man who dared to say Darwin was incomplete, that life itself was cosmic. At the heart of Hoyle's argument was mathematics. He calculated the improbability of assembling complex biomolecules by random chance on Earth. The numbers were astronomical, so astronomical that, to Hoyle, they ruled out terrestrial origin entirely. Biologists countered that Hoyle misunderstood the process, that natural selection and chemical self-organization made the improbable inevitable over vast timescales. But Hoyle refused to budge. To him, the numbers were clear, and the establishment was clinging to dogma. These debates revealed Hoyle's personality in sharp relief. He was bold, witty, and unafraid of ridicule. He relished analogies that captured attention, even if they oversimplified. He thrived on the role of heretic. But he also paid a price. His reputation among biologists collapsed. Even among astronomers, some began to see him as reckless, willing to wander into fields where he lacked expertise. Cambridge colleagues shook their heads, calling him brilliant but misguided. Hoyle, however, wore their disapproval like armor. He insisted that the history of science was written by rebels, not conformists. If he was wrong, so be it. Better to challenge than to follow. Beneath the scientific debate lay a deeper philosophy. Hoyle's panspermia was not just a hypothesis, it was a worldview. He believed the universe was alive, that life was not an accident, but a fundamental feature of cosmic evolution. This vision resonated with his earlier work on nucleosynthesis. Just as the stars forged the elements of life, so too, he argued, did the cosmos forge life itself. Humanity, in Hoyle's eyes, was not the child of a chance accident on Earth, but the heir to a galactic legacy. By embracing panspermia, Hoyle expanded his rebellion from cosmology into biology. He was no longer fighting only the Big Bang establishment. He was now challenging Darwinian orthodoxy. His enemies multiplied, his controversies deepened, and his reputation grew ever more paradoxical, a man of genuine genius, yet perpetually at war with consensus. But for Hoyle, this was the only way to live. To accept orthodoxy without question was, to him, the true heresy. Better to risk ridicule than surrender the freedom to think differently. Most great scientists are remembered for their equations, their discoveries, their experiments. Few venture into the realm of novels. Fred Hoyle was an exception. Just as he defied orthodoxy in cosmology and biology, he defied expectations of what a scientist should be. He was not content to write only papers and lectures. He wanted to reach the public, not just as a teacher, but as a storyteller. In the late 1952nd, Hoyle turned his attention to science fiction. At first, colleagues scoffed. What business had a Cambridge professor in the world of pulp magazines and fantastical tales? But Hoyle saw no contradiction. Science fiction, to him, was an extension of imagination, the very fuel of science itself. His first novel, The Black Cloud, published in 1957, was an immediate sensation. The story told of a massive, intelligent gas cloud drifting into the solar system, threatening Earth. Unlike typical alien invasions of the era, Hoyle's alien was not humanoid, not mechanical, but truly alien, a sentient nebula. The novel was praised for its scientific plausibility. Hoyle's astrophysical background gave the story authenticity, grounding the fantasy in real cosmic principles. Readers were captivated by the blend of hard science and thrilling drama. Critics hailed it as a masterpiece of hard science fiction, a genre where imagination met rigorous scientific detail. But more than that, The Black Cloud revealed Hoyle's personality. The scientists in the novel were blunt, rebellious, skeptical of government interference, thinly veiled versions of Hoyle himself. The book was not only science fiction, it was a manifesto of scientific independence. The success of The Black Cloud transformed Hoyle into more than a professor. He became a public intellectual, a figure whose voice carried beyond the academy into culture. Invitations flowed in for radio talks, television appearances, public lectures. Hoyle embraced the role. He had always enjoyed communicating to wide audiences, and now he had a platform to shape how ordinary people thought about science. His Yorkshire accent, still unusual in elite circles, gave him authenticity. He sounded like no other Cambridge don. To the public, this made him approachable, even charismatic. Encouraged by success, Hoyle wrote more. Among them was A for Andromeda, 1962, a novel co-authored with John Eliot, which was adapted into a BBC television series. The story featured signals from space that enabled humanity to construct a supercomputer, and with it, a genetically engineered woman. The themes were quintessentially Hoyle: distrust of authority, cosmic connection, and the dangerous allure of science in the hands of bureaucrats. The series reached millions, embedding Hoyle even deeper into public imagination. It showed that he was not only a scientist, but also a creator of myths for the modern age, myths shaped not by gods, but by galaxies, not by miracles, but by physics. Hoyle's fiction reflected his contrarian spirit. His heroes were often scientists battling against short-sighted politicians or rigid institutions. His villains were not aliens, but human ignorance, bureaucracy, and dogma. The narratives mirrored his own battles in Cambridge and in cosmology. His bluntness translated into dialogue. His skepticism of authority became plot. His belief in cosmic life echoed through storylines of extraterrestrial intelligence. Even in fiction, Hoyle was Hoyle, the rebel, the outsider, the man who refused to bow. Beyond fiction, Hoyle became a regular voice on the BBC. His lectures were broadcast nationwide. He explained black holes, galaxies, the fate of the universe, all in plain, vivid language. Where many scientists mumbled through jargon, Hoyle spoke with clarity and drama. He used analogies, humor, and provocation. He was not afraid to mock rival theories on air. The public loved him for it. To listeners, he was the scientist who told the truth, who refused to sugarcoat or play politics. His programs reached not only Britain, but also audiences abroad. In an era before internet or podcasts, Hoyle became one of the few scientists whose voice was widely recognized. The public celebrated him. Book sales soared. His broadcasts were replayed. Students flocked to his lectures. But within academia, resentment deepened. Some colleagues accused him of vulgarizing science. Others claimed he was chasing fame rather than truth. The more popular he became, the more suspicion he aroused among Cambridge's conservative hierarchy. Hoyle, as always, ignored them. He relished the attention not for vanity, but because it gave him power. Through books and radio, he could bypass committees and journals. He could speak directly to the people. In doing so, he became one of the first true celebrity scientists. Hoyle's influence on culture cannot be overstated. His fiction inspired young readers who later became scientists. His broadcasts made cosmology part of household conversation. His words gave the public images of sentient clouds, cosmic messages, and star-forged atoms that lingered in memory. He blurred the boundary between science and storytelling, showing that both were forms of imagination disciplined by logic, and in doing so, he ensured that his contrarian spirit reached not just the lecture hall, but the living room. For Hoyle, this was vindication. He believed science was not the property of the elite, but the birthright of all humanity. By writing novels, by speaking on the radio, by telling stories that fused stars and life, he was reclaiming science from the ivory tower and giving it back to the people. But as always, his boldness carried a price. The more he spoke to the public, the more alienated he became from the establishment. Hoyle was building his legend, but also sealing his estrangement from the world of official honors. By the 1962nd and 1972nd, Fred Hoyle was both famous and infamous. To the public, he was a brilliant communicator, the scientist who explained how stars created life, the man who wrote gripping novels about cosmic mysteries. To many colleagues, however, he was a troublemaker, an arrogant contrarian who courted controversy and scorned tradition. Hoyle himself admitted to being a difficult colleague. He once said, half-jokingly, "I don't suffer fools gladly, and I see too many fools in high positions." It was a remark that summed up both his wit and his recklessness. The clearest symbol of Hoyle's clashes with the establishment came in 1983. That year, the Nobel Prize in Physics was awarded to William Fowler for work on stellar nucleosynthesis, the very field Hoyle had pioneered. Fowler deserved recognition, but the exclusion of Hoyle stunned many. Hoyle had been the first to predict the carbon-12 resonance, the key mechanism that allowed life to exist. His contribution to the famous B²FH paper was central. Without him, the theory of stellar nucleosynthesis would not have existed. And yet the Nobel Committee ignored him. Why? Many whispered it was punishment for his personality, his sharp tongue, his refusal to conform, his attacks on orthodoxy. The committee preferred safe choices, not rebels. Hoyle himself did not take the snub quietly. He declared the Nobel system corrupt, more concerned with politics than science. "The Nobel Prize is given not for merit, but for being in the right club," he said. His words burned bridges, but he did not care. To him, truth mattered more than honors. The continuing rise of the Big Bang model only deepened Hoyle's alienation. In the 1962nd, the discovery of the cosmic microwave background radiation seemed decisive evidence for a hot, finite-age universe. Most cosmologists embraced it. Hoyle, however, refused to surrender. He proposed alternative explanations. Perhaps the radiation was the result of dust or of processes within galaxies. He published papers defending the steady-state model long after others had abandoned it. To critics, this was stubbornness bordering on delusion. To Hoyle, it was integrity. He believed abandoning the steady state without exhausting every possibility was intellectual cowardice. His refusal to concede hardened his reputation as a maverick unwilling to admit defeat. Inside Cambridge, Hoyle's confrontations with the establishment became personal. In 1971, he was appointed director of the newly created Institute of Theoretical Astronomy. For a moment, it seemed the university was recognizing his stature. But Hoyle's leadership style, direct, blunt, impatient with bureaucracy, clashed with the genteel politics of Cambridge. He made enemies among administrators. He resigned in frustration in 1972, after only a year. Later, when he was passed over for the prestigious Plumian professorship, Hoyle saw it as deliberate exclusion. He was convinced that Cambridge would never truly accept him. To many within the university, Hoyle had simply made too many enemies. Every clash revealed Hoyle's essential personality. He was fearless, unwilling to compromise, unafraid to offend. He saw himself as a truth-teller in a world of hypocrites. Yet this same trait that made him admirable also made him isolated. He could inspire loyalty among students and collaborators, but he could also alienate potential allies. His barbed comments, delivered with Yorkshire bluntness, cut through pretense but also left scars. Hoyle once said, "Consensus is the enemy of science." When everyone agrees, it usually means no one is thinking. It was a motto he lived by. But in living by it, he guaranteed endless conflict with institutions that thrived on consensus. Ironically, while official recognition often eluded him, public recognition soared. His books sold widely. His lectures were broadcast internationally. He was knighted by the Queen in 1972, an honor that acknowledged his stature even as Cambridge sidelined him. To ordinary people, Hoyle was a hero, the scientist who said what he thought, who refused to bow to authority. To the scientific establishment, he was a problem, brilliant but disruptive, accomplished but insubordinate. By the late 20th century, Fred Hoyle's reputation was cemented as one of science's great rebels. He was admired for his discoveries, yet notorious for his defiance. He was excluded from prizes, yet included in the public imagination. He was a knight of the realm, yet an outsider in his own university. These clashes did not embitter him entirely. They energized him. Hoyle thrived on controversy, on the battle of ideas, on the role of heretic, but they also left him isolated, a man both celebrated and sidelined, admired and dismissed. Fred Hoyle, a genius whose discoveries changed science, yet whose personality kept him at odds with the establishment. His clashes were not accidents but extensions of his character. He could no more bow to consensus than he could stop breathing. And so, Hoyle's life became a story not only of discovery, but of defiance. A man who created the language of the Big Bang only to fight it. A man who discovered the origins of life's atoms only to be denied the Nobel Prize. A man who spoke to millions yet felt rejected by his peers. Hoyle was not merely a scientist. He was a fighter against orthodoxy, against authority, against the compromises of the establishment. And in that fight, he became unforgettable. By the 1982nd and 1992nd, Fred Hoyle was no longer the young Yorkshireman fighting his way into Cambridge. He was a knighted scientist, a world-famous figure, a man whose voice had echoed across radio, television, and books. Yet despite the passage of time, one thing never changed: his refusal to yield. The Big Bang theory, once controversial, had become dominant. The discovery of the cosmic microwave background radiation in 1965 had convinced nearly all cosmologists. By the 1992nd, satellite data confirmed it in exquisite detail. To the scientific world, the debate was over. But not for Hoyle. Even in his later years, he continued to publish papers questioning the Big Bang. He suggested alternative explanations, from interstellar dust to new physics. Critics dismissed his arguments as desperate attempts to keep a dead theory alive. Hoyle, however, saw himself as defending intellectual freedom against premature consensus. Hoyle's refusal to accept the Big Bang was not just scientific, it was personal. To him, conceding would mean betraying his own principles. Never bow to authority, never accept an idea simply because others did. He once said, "The universe is not only queerer than we suppose, it is queerer than we can suppose." For Hoyle, this meant science must always remain open, always skeptical, always willing to defy the crowd. Even as his health declined, he continued to write, argue, and provoke. Friends urged him to let go of old battles, but Hoyle would not. To him, rebellion was not a phase of youth, but the essence of truth-seeking. In his final decades, Hoyle received many honors. He was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society. He was knighted. He was awarded medals and international prizes. Yet the absence of the Nobel remained a bitter wound. He rarely spoke of it directly, but those who knew him sensed the resentment. He had given the world the understanding that we are made of stardust, yet others had received the glory. For a man who distrusted prizes, he still felt the sting of exclusion. At the same time, Hoyle never softened his criticism of the establishment. He believed science had grown too bureaucratic, too cautious, too concerned with protecting reputations. He argued that true discovery required risk, imagination, and the courage to stand alone. Hoyle's legacy was not confined to cosmology. His novels, his radio broadcasts, and his provocative analogies had left deep imprints on culture. Phrases like the Big Bang and the tornado in a junkyard entered everyday language. Generations of students were inspired by his lectures, even if they later disagreed with his theories. He had shown that scientists could be public figures, storytellers, even provocateurs. Long before Carl Sagan or Stephen Hawking, Hoyle had turned cosmology into a conversation with the world. In his final decades, Hoyle continued his partnership with Chandra Wickramasinghe, promoting panspermia and the idea that life was cosmic. They published books claiming that influenza and even AIDS might have extraterrestrial origins. These claims drew fierce criticism, but Hoyle never retracted them. For him, the ridicule of others was irrelevant. What mattered was daring to ask. If others dismissed his ideas, so be it. The history of science, he argued, was full of rebels, once mocked, later vindicated. He believed he stood in that lineage. Hoyle also became a kind of philosopher. He argued that science without imagination was sterile, and imagination without defiance was meaningless. He believed the greatest danger to science was not ignorance, but conformity. In essays and interviews, he returned again and again to the theme of rebellion. He warned that institutions stifled innovation, that consensus killed curiosity. His own life stood as an example. Brilliance entangled with defiance, genius inseparable from stubbornness. In the late 1992, Hoyle's health began to fail. A series of strokes and a fall in 2001 left him weakened. Yet even then, he continued to dictate notes and ideas, refusing to let silence claim him. On the 20th of August 2001, Fred Hoyle died at the age of 86. Tributes poured in from around the world. Colleagues praised his discoveries, even as they acknowledged his controversies. Obituaries described him as brilliant, stubborn, provocative, a rebel to the end. Hoyle's legacy is paradoxical. He gave the Big Bang its name, yet rejected it. He discovered how the stars made life possible, yet was denied the Nobel. He inspired millions through novels and broadcasts, yet alienated many colleagues. He was celebrated as a knight, yet often treated as an outsider. But perhaps this paradox is the essence of Fred Hoyle. He was not a man of compromise. He was not designed for smooth acceptance or gentle consensus. He was, in life and in science, a rebel. And rebels leave legacies not of peace, but of fire. Today, scientists may disagree with Hoyle's cosmology, but they cannot ignore his contributions. Every time a student learns that carbon is forged in stars, they are touching Hoyle's insight. Every time the phrase Big Bang is spoken, they are repeating Hoyle's words. His defiance lives on as a reminder that science is not only equations, but arguments, not only consensus, but challenge. Fred Hoyle's true legacy is not only in the stars he explained, but in the rebellious spirit he embodied, the courage to think differently, even when the world says you are wrong. By the 1992nd, Sir Fred Hoyle was in his late 70s and early 80s. Most scientists of his generation had retired into quiet reflection, content to let their younger colleagues carry on the work. But Hoyle was not like most scientists. Retirement to him was surrender. As long as he could think, he would argue. As long as he could write, he would publish. His Yorkshire bluntness had not softened with age. If anything, it had sharpened. He remained deeply skeptical of the Big Bang, dismissing new evidence as flawed interpretations or premature conclusions. He still championed panspermia, insisting that life was cosmic, and he still spoke with the same rebellious confidence that had defined him for half a century. Even as cosmology advanced, Hoyle stayed defiant. In the 1992nd data from the COBE satellite confirmed the fine details of the cosmic microwave background. For most cosmologists, this was final, irrefutable proof of the Big Bang. Textbooks declared victory. Hoyle disagreed. With Wickramasinghe, he published papers arguing for alternative interpretations, suggesting that cosmic dust or other mechanisms could account for the radiation. Few took these claims seriously. Yet Hoyle persisted, unwilling to let consensus end the debate. To critics, this was stubbornness, bordering on obsession. To supporters, it was integrity, a refusal to accept authority simply because it was authority. Either way, Hoyle remained the outsider, still clashing with the establishment even in old age. His collaboration with Chandra Wickramasinghe became even more important in his final decades. The two men published book after book promoting the cosmic origin of life. They argued that comets carried organic material, that viruses could fall from space, that evolution was driven not just by earthbound processes, but by the cosmos itself. Their claims grew ever bolder. In the 1992nd, they suggested that diseases like influenza might arrive from space, carried by dust and comets. Mainstream scientists dismissed these ideas as fringe, but Hoyle relished the outrage. For him, provocation was a duty. Wickramasinghe later described Hoyle as a mentor, a father figure, and a warrior, uncompromising, fearless, unwilling to retreat. Together, they embodied the spirit of intellectual rebellion, standing against the tide of mainstream biology and cosmology. Despite his mental fire, Hoyle's body began to betray him. In 1997, he suffered a series of small strokes that affected his speech and memory. He recovered partially, but the decline was noticeable. For a man who had built his life on sharp wit and cutting words, the frailty was cruel. In 2001, while hiking near his home in the Lake District, Hoyle fell and suffered severe injuries, including a fractured skull. He was hospitalized, and though he briefly rallied, his health never fully returned. The fall marked the beginning of the end. Even in illness, he remained intellectually restless. Visitors recalled him dictating notes, discussing cosmology, and criticizing the Big Bang from his hospital bed. His mind, though weakened, refused to surrender. Those close to Hoyle in his last years described a man who, though diminished in strength, never abandoned his principles. He remained convinced that the Big Bang was wrong, that life was cosmic, that science required rebels. He sometimes reflected on the ironies of his life, how he had given the Big Bang its name, yet spent his career rejecting it, how he had predicted the carbon resonance, yet been denied the Nobel, how he had been celebrated by the public, yet alienated within Cambridge. But if he felt bitterness, he also felt vindication. He believed his role had been to keep science honest, to prevent consensus from hardening into dogma. Whether right or wrong, he had played that role to the end. On the 20th of August, 2001, Fred Hoyle died at the age of 86. News spread quickly. Obituaries appeared in major newspapers across the world. Scientists who had battled him praised his brilliance, even as they acknowledged his stubbornness. Admirers mourned the passing of a rebel. Critics admitted, grudgingly, that science was richer for his defiance. Hoyle was buried in the Yorkshire soil that had shaped him, the soil of blunt speech and stubborn pride. His ashes, fittingly, were scattered in the hills of his homeland, a final return to the landscape that had forged his contrarian spirit. In the days and weeks after his death, tributes poured in. Some hailed him as one of the greatest astrophysicists of the 20th century. Others called him brilliant but misguided, a man whose stubbornness marred his legacy. Nearly all agreed he was unforgettable. His colleagues remembered the biting wit of his lectures, the daring of his predictions, the courage of his rebellion. Students remembered his charisma, his refusal to let them think passively. The public remembered his novels, his broadcasts, his plain-spoken voice on the radio. Hoyle's critics acknowledged, too, that even when he was wrong, he forced science to sharpen its arguments. By challenging the Big Bang, he compelled cosmologists to strengthen their evidence. By questioning Darwin, he forced biologists to refine their explanations. His opposition, though often futile, was valuable. Fred Hoyle's death in 2001 did not silence him. His ideas, his phrases, his controversies live on, woven into the very fabric of modern science and culture. He is remembered not simply as an astrophysicist, but as a paradox, the man who gave the Big Bang its name while denying its truth, the man who unlocked the secrets of stardust yet was denied the Nobel Prize, the man who inspired millions with plain words yet alienated colleagues with sharp ones. Hoyle was not one thing, he was many things, often contradictory, and it is this contradiction that ensures his immortality. In cosmology, Hoyle's steady-state theory is long abandoned. The evidence for the Big Bang is overwhelming, confirmed by satellites and telescopes with precision he never imagined. To many, this might seem to tarnish his reputation. Yet the opposite is true. Hoyle's rebellion forced the Big Bang to earn its place. By resisting consensus, by ridiculing the theory with the phrase Big Bang, Hoyle compelled cosmologists to strengthen their evidence, to refine their models, to prove beyond doubt. Science advanced because he refused to surrender. In astrophysics, his legacy is clearer still. The theory of stellar nucleosynthesis, his vision of stars as forges of the elements, remains one of the crowning achievements of 20th century science. Every student who learns that carbon, oxygen, and iron were born in stars is inheriting Hoyle's insight. Every breath of life carries his discovery, that we are indeed made of stardust. Beyond equations, Hoyle shaped imagination. His novels, The Black Cloud and A for Andromeda, introduced readers to cosmic intelligence and the dangers of unchecked authority. His BBC broadcasts brought cosmology into living rooms. His sharp analogies, the tornado in a junkyard, the Big Bang entered common speech. He showed that scientists could be public figures, myth-makers of the modern age. In this, he paved the way for later figures like Carl Sagan, Stephen Hawking, and Neil deGrasse Tyson. Hoyle proved that science was not only for journals, but for everyone. Yet his story is also one of loss. Hoyle's defiance cost him recognition. The Nobel Prize eluded him, likely as much for his personality as for politics. Cambridge, the institution he served for decades, often treated him as an outsider. His fiercest battles left him isolated, a legend but also a loner. This is the paradox. Hoyle's greatness was inseparable from his rebellion, yet that same rebellion denied him honors. His strength was his weakness, his victories, his defeats. Hoyle has become a symbol of the heretic in science, the figure who refuses consensus, who demands evidence, who questions the unquestioned. Such figures are both necessary and dangerous. Without them, science stagnates. With them, science risks distraction and division. Hoyle embodied this tension. He was wrong about the steady state, wrong about cosmic viruses. Yet he was gloriously right about nucleosynthesis, magnificently right about the power of rebellion. His career is a reminder that science is not a straight line to truth, but a battlefield of ideas, littered with victories, defeats, and contradictions. What does Fred Hoyle teach us? Perhaps that science is human, full of pride, stubbornness, brilliance, and error. Perhaps that rebellion, even when wrong, has value. Perhaps that personality cannot be separated from discovery that the fire that drives genius also burns bridges. Hoyle's life warns against arrogance, yet also against conformity. It shows the danger of clinging too long to lost causes, yet also the courage required to stand alone. It is a story of triumph and tragedy, inseparable, eternal. Hoyle often insisted that the universe was stranger than we could imagine. He may have been wrong about its age and origin, but he was right about its strangeness. The cosmos continues to surprise, to defy, to humble. In that sense, Hoyle's spirit lingers in every discovery that overturns expectation. Fred Hoyle remains an immortal contradiction. The rebel who gave his enemy a name, the outsider who revealed humanity's stardust heritage, the contrarian whose defiance shaped the very science that rejected him. His story ends not with closure, but with the open sky vast, mysterious, rebellious. just as Hoyle would have wanted it.